G'day guys, welcome to the webinar. We've got Rod from our solutions team and my name's Pat. Today we're going to be talking about the Vic emergency backstop that's coming into effect in October. So you can see here it says session number 1. We'll be running another session closer to the date, but we thought it was important just to get through some of the information to you as quickly as possible. So that's why we're doing this session now. This is a pre-recorded session, but Rod will be online at the time that it's being streamed to you guys. So he will be there live to answer any questions that you have at the end. So please use the chat function and put in any questions that may come to you. So without further ado, we'll jump into it.
Thanks, Pat. And like as Pat said, this is session 1. So everything that I show you in this session is kind of preliminary. There's a lot of unknowns at the moment, especially with some of the DNSPs in terms of their onboarding process, their testing process in the field, also their limits when, let's say, loss of internet connection or when they actually send out commands, what those limits are. Also, the DNSP portals is not, let's say, they're not really 100% finished yet, so that's why we're closer to the date. Obviously it's 1st of October, closer to that date we'll run a second session which will have more exact information hopefully by that time and more detailed information as well. All right, well let's get started. So yeah, first thing, it's all about the Victorian emergency backstop. This is a massive change to the industry, especially a massive change for Victorian installers. It will have a big impact, I think, so stay tuned and have a listen in and be prepared to put out any questions that you might have as well. So just to give you some of the content we'll go through today. So first, what is emergency backstop? A little bit of a rough explanation of that. Which Victorian DNSPs are involved? How does that, what does it mean for installers? How does it affect them? Also a big question is, because this is via the internet, what happens if you get dropouts? What are the actual changes? What are the additional things you need to do as an installer to get this set up? Then also some question time at the end. All right, so I guess start off with what is emergency backstop? So as the name says, it's a backstop that should be used only in emergencies or in, let's say, minimum demand events. So this control mechanism or this whole thing has come from AEMO. They obviously look after the stability of the grid, and so AEMO determines if there's instability in the grid or if there's the minimum demand is undercut. They give a directive to DNSPs, who then have the responsibility to remotely shut down systems with each individual OEM. So this happens in a minimum demand event or an emergency event. Okay, so the controls is done via over the air, if you want to call it, or cloud, so via the internet. So that's using the IEEE 23.5 protocol. I know it's a bit of gobbledygook with that, so it's a standard which has been divulged or developed to communication of what we call DERs in the field. And that is the base standard. A section of that is what we call CCIP-Oz, and that is like an implementation guide or certain parts of the standard being taken out specifically for Australia. So a few additional things have been put in there as well. So you may have heard that word, that kind of buzzword, I guess, or that word CCIP-Oz. That's the standard that the communication works on. Okay, DNSPs. If you're all Victorian installers, you probably know this anyway, but I thought I'd just reiterate it. So you've got 5 DNSPs in Victoria. 3 of those are actually kind of joined. They still operate under the individual names and have their individual areas, but from a server and communications perspective, us Fronius, we're communicating with one of those. So that's City Power, Powercore, and United Energy. They're one. Then you've got AusNet, and then you've got Gemini with that. Okay, so how does this technically work? So this is where it gets a bit complicated. I'll try and make it sound, as easy to explain as possible. So basically, start off, as you can see here, an emergency event is detected, or let's say minimum demand detected from AEMO. AEMO gives that directive to the DNSPs. Then the DNSPs NAD within their utility server. So each DNSP has what they call a cloud utility server that contains the constraints or the limits that need to be picked up by the OEMs or the inverters, etc. So they will then publish within their system what the export limit is or generation limit. When I say generation limit, so an export limit is fairly straightforward, what's able to be exported to the grid. A generation limit is what the inverter itself is allowed to produce. Okay, so what's actually coming out of its terminals. So they will publish a limit with a schedule. So a schedule is then a time. So in this type of protocol, it works on a start time and a duration. There is no end time, so to say, but the end time is derived from the duration. Then the Fronius server, so our server is polling the utility server, asking, okay, what's my limit, at a certain, what they call poll rate. So that can vary depending on the times. It could be 15 minutes, it could be 5 minutes, etc. We poll the DNSP server and we know what that limit is for that particular device or set of devices. So we receive the limit from the DNSP and in our server, and we forward that to the inverters. So the inverters then accept that and it's stored on the inverter as a schedule and then executes that at the time it needs to be done. So that could be immediately or that could be in the future as well. So they might say, okay, in an hour or in 2 hours, it needs to go to a certain limit and that'll be stored on the inverter and it has an expiry, which is the duration. Then AEMO will probably look at the system stability and see if that is then sufficient, and if not, they will then go to a generation limit. So meaning that another command will be issued and the inverter, instead of being an export limit, it will be a generation limit. So reducing it, in other words, creating more load on the grid. So some things to remember here is that the schedule that is sent to the inverter is stored on the inverter. So if you switch the inverter on and off or try and reboot it or whatever, it will stay on the inverter. It will then it'll execute it and do whatever it needs to do with the schedule.
And Rod, you can have overlapping schedules, right?
Correct, yeah. So they can have overlapping schedules that then, depending on the priority of those schedules, then that'll determine which one is then executed first, etc. Okay, so in general, what does that mean for installers? So look, there's going to be a lot of different things here. I'm just going to cover some of the main things to know from the start. So the first thing is that it needs to be connected to the internet. So this is all done via internet protocol. First thing you're probably going to ask, so what happens if my site doesn't have internet? Or what do I do? So there is some exemptions or dispensation that you can apply for with the DNSP. These are not 100% set in stone how this is done, etc. So if you're very rural and say the customer doesn't have internet and it's very difficult to get it, that's something you could apply for dispensation. If it's something like in a city and the ease of getting internet is there, then that may not be allowed. So it's definitely not a tick and flick. They're going to be quite, from what I've heard, they're going to be quite strict with it. But there is, and if it is not able to be connected to the internet, then they will be given a fixed limit of, depending on what the DNSP limit is, could be 500, could be 1 kilowatt or 1.5. It's not 100% set in stone yet. The other thing is that from now on, all systems will require a smart meter or energy meter, depending on how you want to put it. So like an export meter. The reason for that is, first of all, it needs to be able to pass the test. So it goes through what they call capability tests. And secondly, the DNSPs, this is what I've been told, is they want to prepare for flexible exports going forward. So if someone wants to then go on to flexible exports and increase their export from their set, let's say 5 or 1, whatever they've been issued for that site, then it's a really easy transition. It's just a software change, etc. So there's no hardware needed. Yeah. So that's their kind of future-proofing type of plan from what I've heard. The inverter firmware will definitely need to be updated, unless you always do that anyway. That should be general good practice, but you'll need to update that to have the latest firmware in order to do this cloud control. There will be a few additional settings needed on the inverter interface. So when you do your normal commissioning, there'll be a few extra little steps. And on Solar.web, there'll be a couple of extra steps at all. So capability test will then, so once you've got all that set up and the inverter is then registered with the utility server, we'll go into that a little bit later in some of the slides. Then there will be what they call a capability test or an export limit type test, similar to what they do in South Australia. Yeah. It's not 100% known how that's going to be done, if it's in the DNSP app or if it's in their portal, etc. But basically what they'll entail is if the system's exporting, the utility server will issue a zero export command. It'll check the telemetry data and make sure that it's doing what it's meant to do. It'll hold that for like 5 minutes and then it'll release it and then see that the inverter ramps back up again. So it's kind of testing that functionality. So as I said, that's not known how that's all going to work yet, but that will be a test that will need to be done. If that's not done, then it'll be stuck on what they call the local limit, or even perhaps like a default limit of, could be 500 watts, a kilowatt, or even 0, depending on what that is. Okay, so good, I think often a question that gets asked, this is all internet connected, and we know how fun internet connectivity can be sometimes. So what happens if the internet is lost? So within the protocol, there's a thing called default control, or default DER control, and that's basically like a fallback limit if the active control that's been picked up or used for the inverter at that particular time is lost or expires because it's gone offline. So those limits are picked up by our server and sent to the inverters, long in advance, and are stored on the inverter. And these are kind of longer time frames as well. So that default control, usually if an active control sent, it'll be for a short duration, let's say half an hour or something. If the internet's lost, that control expires, and so the default one that's stored in the background will be implemented directly on the device. So in normal conditions, it'd be running on what they call an active control. But then when it loses internet, after a specified time, okay, that can vary depending on how the DNSP is doing it, then that will then default, or as the name says, enable that default value, and it'll be stuck on that value. So as I said here, I've heard values of 500, of a kilowatt, 1.5, etc., depending on the DNSP. Once the internet is restored again, then it'll pick up from the server what the active control is, which is then likely higher than that, and it'll go back to, let's say it's 5 kilowatt or whatever it's allowed for that particular site. Mm-hmm. Okay, in terms of additional settings, what does that look like from a rough overview from a Fronius perspective? So we've obviously got the SnapInverters and the Gen 24s or Tauros out there. So there's two different, the web interface looks different, so the actual settings are slightly different. So you can see here one of the things, so updating the data manager on the firmware on the data manager is very important. So at least 3.31 will need to be on there. That's the current one at the moment. That will need to be updated. Then you also need to set a static limit. So like you normally do with export limited systems on the inverter itself, you set a static one, a soft limit within that, and that'll be whatever the DNSP's issued you for that particular site. Could that vary? Might be 5. Most of the time probably be 5, but you may have low ones in rural areas. And then the most important thing is you need to enable the cloud control. So some of you may be aware of that if you do some work interstate as well. But what that feature does is it enables remote, as the name says, remote control commands to be accepted by the inverter itself. So if that's forgotten, then we do have methods of, through a secure channel, of being able to update that remotely, should it need to be done. However, it should be part of the commissioning process when the installer does it. So, because otherwise, if you don't have that enabled, then at the time of doing the capability test, it won't work because it won't be registered, etc. It won't accept the commands. Okay, so for the Gen 24 Tauro Verto, that platform which uses a pilot rather than the data manager, that will need the 1.33 firmware version, which is not out yet. That should be out at the time of this recording. May have been out, but it'll maybe mid-September at the latest. Again, you'll need to enable or set a local export control. And also you'll need to activate the cloud control function on the web interface itself. It does look a bit different. So you set it to on, and then you'll need to do it for the technician one, not for VPP. I mean, they both do the same anyway, but usually that'll be set for the regulatory purposes type 1. Then on Solar.web after that, you do your normal setting or adding a system, putting in the address details, installation date, etc., state. Then now, going forward, you'll need to put in the grid operator So we've got all of them in there. So we've got Gemini, United Energy, PowerCore, they're all individually in there. You set that at the first tab, and then underneath that, you have the field for the NMI. So that will need to be entered as well. Then depending on when you put it in, so the NMI field, when you put that in and you go to save it, there is what we call a regex check. That checks certain parameters, so what the start number is, how many digits it is, the coding of the number, etc. So if you do get it wrong, it should hopefully detect it. It's not 100% foolproof. It also detect if it's the length is correct and the checksum and things at the end. If it does come up with an error message, then it's most likely because either the number is wrong or it's already being used, on another site. So someone may have used the wrong number, or potentially there's 2 NMIs on the site. That can be a bit of an edge case, which would be a weird one.
So what would you do in that case?
So in that case, if it's not accepting it, then you'll need to contact tech support to take a look. Obviously check if the number is correct, and if you can definitely check it, from the customer's bill. Potentially even check with the DNSP if they can make sure that NMI is correct for that site. Then obviously our tech support will need to look in the back end and find out what it is. Then there's a checkbox underneath it. The wording at the moment is just designed for South Australia, but we will be changing that wording very soon to align with the Victorian one. So that checkbox needs to be ticked, but not all for all DNSPs. Unfortunately, at the moment, UE, PowerCore and CityPower and AusNet, they all have what they call an in-band registration. That means that as soon as you put in the NMI and tick that box, etc., and you hit save at the bottom of the screen, then in the background, that will create what they call an LFDI. So that's that really long digit at the bottom. So an LFDI is short for long form device identifier. You don't really need to remember what it's for, but that's a long number that is used to register that device or that system in the utility server, so in the server from the DNSP. So everyone except for Gemini will have what they call in-band registration, meaning that once you put your NMI and select the DNSP and hit save, that'll automatically register that device. It'll create that long number, register it, send it to the DNSP and register it, and things like that. Even though it'll show up in Solar.web, you don't need to do anything with that number. Gemini, on the other hand, at the moment, is that number, they don't have that in-band registration function, meaning that you'll need to manually register it. So that number will appear at the bottom, and it's not 100% clear yet how you'll do this, but in the Gemini portal, you'll need to copy and paste that number into the Gemini portal with the NMI, and that'll do the registration on their part. So that's pretty much it in Solar.web. That's all that needs to be done on that side of things. So that's kind of like the rough run through of what we know so far.
Cool. All right, that was really informative. Thank you, Rod. You've covered off some of the questions I already had here, but I had a few more. So the start date is October 1st. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, that's something that gets asked quite often. So October 1st is the date that is used where this initiative or this system is going to be working. But that 1st of October date is from application date. So that's not the date when you're installing. So let's say you've put in an application mid-September or start of September, but obviously quite a few people have longer lead times. You go and install that, let's say, not till the first week of October. That's not counted. So it's only for applications, pretty sure it's approved applications, that are done after 1st of October. So basically, if anyone's got a bit of a lag in terms of their installs, like they sell a system and then it takes a week or two until they install it, then you'll have like a slow ramp up from systems that that start to go in. So it's going by the application date and not the actual install date.
Yeah. Okay. And then existing Fronius systems, are they impacted by the change, or if you do anything to their system, expand them? How does that work?
Yeah, so they're not grandfathering it in a way. So existing systems that are not touched, but nothing's happening, they're just working as they are at the moment. They won't be pulled into it. However, if you do any changes to it, if you upgrade the system, add more PV, add another inverter, etc., then that existing system will need to be brought into the plan, from what I've heard. So, let's say you've got a 5 kilowatt system and you want to add another 5 kilowatt inverter or something. then that existing 5 will have to come into this whole control mechanism as well.
Yeah, okay. And when it's active, can you see anything in Solar.web to tell you that it's active?
Not at this stage. It is something that we're looking at doing and planning, so that people can see what's going on. But at the moment, it's not possible yet.
Yeah. Okay. And if you have a mixture of Fronius inverters, say Gen 24s, Tauros, SnapInverters, do you need any other device, third-party device, or anything like that?
Okay, so the plans we're working on at the moment. So at the moment, any single device systems, we've passed all the tests, and we're on the list of the DNSPs in the background already. So we've gone all through that, and we're all good. With the multi-inverter systems, we need to implement a few things on the cloud in order to be able to do that. However, the timeline is set. We have been promised that will be ready by October 1st. So for any, it's mixed systems or multiple snaps, multiple Gen 24s or Tauros, that all will be covered by that in-house, so no third-party device required. There may be some edge cases which we're still looking to at the moment. Let's say a site has multiple systems in Solar.web, but they have the same NMI, so they want to split the systems up on Solar.web but the same NMI. That may be a bit difficult, or again, if you've got multiple NMIs on a site with a bigger system, those ones could be a little bit tricky. So we're looking into solutions for that, but they should be real edge cases where you require it.
Yeah. Okay. So otherwise, it'd just be smart meter and internet connectivity, and you're good to go.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And roughly any costs? Are there any other costs involved apart from that hardware?
No, so it's all done, obviously it's done by the customer's internet there, so there's no additional costs. It's the software, it's just all done via software, etc. So there's no additional cost for the customer or for the installer either. Yeah.
Yep. Yep, that's pretty good. They've covered off all my questions. I'm sure you guys might have some additional questions, so please put them through to the chat. Rod will be there to answer them. But otherwise, thank you for your time, and thank you for your time, Rod.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can all hear me out there. I'm just in New Zealand at the moment, so couldn't attend, hence we made the pre-recording. So yeah, if you've got any other questions that you would prefer me to answer via speaking, I guess, rather than typing it in, then shoot away. I'm just looking at the question tab. Yep. Okay, so someone's got here, does it integrate with catch power? So depending on what you're using the catch power for, if you're just using it for normal metering, like in terms of mocking the Fronius meter, then you can use either or. You can either use catch to do the controlling, to do the emergency backstop, or you can use the in-house Fronius with it, depending on what your actual functionality or what it is that you're trying to do on that. Okay, so we got here, not able to listen before. Is there a recording? Maybe Kenny, I'll get you to answer that one there. I'm not sure how that works. Got here, so 2 Gen 24s, okay, what about 2 Gen 24 and a snap? Yep, that's so we've got a webinar coming up in a few days, which is called the multi-inverter export limiting, which is done via TCP. This is where we are able to control, I have one master inverter, a Gen 24 or a Tauro or a Verto when it comes, and that'll then control the snap inverter. So that'll all be covered off within the emergency backstop as well. Emergency backstop mode, the system production won't be, so it says here, won't be available for self-use as well, right? So this is the fun one with the DNSP. So look, it's still not 100% clear, but from what we've heard is the first command will be an export limit. So because it's an export limit, whatever the site consumption is, the inverter will still ramp itself up and down in order to offset that. We have heard some limits of 0 export, so it'll go to a 0 export, but still meaning you can offset your own loads for self-use. If that's not enough, or if they see that the minimum demand is still causing issues, then they have said that they will issue a further command, which is in a generation limit. And that's literally culling the generation out of the inverter down to whatever value that might be 0. So meaning that then they will have no self-consumption in that case. But as I said, it's a stepped approach. The first step is just to do an export limit. Will Fronius have extra staff, tech support to ease into this? Look, we're doing pretty well with the tech support staff at the moment. We do envisage that that's going to be quite a few people calling with it. So we are making an application guide for it, so a PDF to follow through. Also, we are going to run a second webinar, session 2, probably about a week or two just before the rollout of October 1st. And so with that, we've hopefully a lot of the questions answered, but in terms of if you've got issues on site, yeah, I think it will be an issue for everyone. I think also with the DNSPs and working out whose issue it is. I guess that'll be the fun one, but we're going to do our best to accommodate what we can with that. So in those first few weeks, we do have more tech support people on. We can get onto the phones. What happens with sites with different inverter brands? Good question. That one, you would most likely have to use something like a third-party controller. So let's say a Catch Power or a Zico Marshall or one of these types of systems. We don't have the capability of controlling a second inverter, or let's say a non-Fronius inverter at this stage. It's something we are potentially looking at, but at this stage we don't. You'll need a third-party device for that. With battery installations that rely on monitoring export to redirect power to charge the battery, how will this work if reduced to 0 export? Good question. So from a Fronius perspective, depends on if system configuration. If you have a system that's DC coupled, so a Gen 24 with a BYD battery, then even though it's set to 0 export, the excess power will go into the battery when it can. For AC coupled systems, let's say it's a Powerwall or something, that one's going to be a little bit more interesting. But usually the Powerwall has some settings in there which allows you to kind of push the inverter to export a little bit, so it can kind of ramp itself up to self-consume. So, but that may be a bit of a trickier one with an AC battery. But with a DC coupled, that shouldn't make a difference. In the event that internet connection is lost, is the default setting an export one or a generation one? Also a good question. There'll be two. There'll be both of them there. They'll just have different scheduling times from what I heard. So the first one will be an export limit. And then I think with a much longer time, it could be a generation limit. But this is something which is not set in stone yet. So hopefully we'll have more information around the exact default limits and the fallback times and all these things going forward. So just as an FYI, UE, Power Core, etc., running a webinar. I think it's in the next week or two. Same with Gemini, and I think AusNet just had a basic one. But what I've heard from them, they're going to run a more technical one, a lot closer to the limit, or to the date. So stay tuned for those, because they'll be able to give you more information on that. How will this work with batteries? If DNSP tell the inverters to ramp down to force buying off the grid, how will the battery system work? Will it keep charging batteries? So again, that's dependent on if it's a DC system, DC coupled. If it's DC coupled, if our inverter gets set to a generation limit of 0, any of that power will go to the battery. And obviously if the battery is full, then the power will go nowhere, because it's not allowed to go out of the inverter's terminals. What about three-phase system on grid electronics and SnapInverters? That's a good one as well. So any remote commands that we send override any local commands. So because these are remote ones sent via a server, then any, let's say, Modbus commands or anything like that that have been used by the electronic, because that's how it controls it to go up and down, they'll be overridden by the remote ones. Is there plans to have unbalanced generation on three-phase inverters due to export limiting? Yes, we do have that functionality on our three-phase inverters, or let's say on the Gen 24s. However, it's not
because your utility meter is net metered, then it doesn't make a lot of sense, or it's not really needed in Australia. In New Zealand it is, because they do per phase metering, but in Australia that shouldn't make a difference, at least on the 3-phase anyway. What about charging a battery regeneration limit, not export limit? As I said before, similar question. If it's DC coupled, that won't make a difference. If it's AC coupled, then the generation limit, then yeah, basically that will won't be able to charge in that case. So your Powerwall 2s, etc., won't be able to charge, or any other AC coupled battery, I guess, in that case. Will Fronius produce a clear instruction sheet for customers when they change their modem to update their Wi-Fi settings? We do have some videos on that. It's something that's a good point. I'll speak to Pat, who is in the video. We'll make sure and see if we can get some more videos and some more content on that. I'm pretty sure we do have some video content, at least for the SnapInverters. I'll double check about the Gen 24s, but yeah, that's all. Double check that we have that YouTube videos that you can send customers as well. The DNSP have too much power, and they're cutting my generation beyond extra episodes. Are they going to pay me to consume their power? Good question. Something you're going to need to ask the DNSPs for that. That's nothing I can really tell you on that one. I think from what I've heard is that that's the requirement of putting in a new system, and the customer signs off on that and knows that could potentially be the case. I know that's going to be an extremely difficult conversation for you guys to have, especially being in front of the customers. But again, I think that's you should really address that to the DNSPs, especially in some of these webinars that they're having. I think it's a really good place to raise that issue. Assume all this DNSP control is on the DC side of the inverter. Yes and no. So it's indirectly. So in order to control the AC, you reduce the DC input, and that's done by moving the MPP point on the DC input, and then that in turn reduces your AC output. So based on historic trends, do we have a rough idea of how often this or such events may occur and the duration? Of course, it's ever evolving space. Look, it's a real crystal ball, that one. It's very difficult. From what I've heard, these shutdown things should be quite rare, and they're usually a last resort as well. There's a lot of other levers and triggers they can do before they come to residential systems. So larger, like utility scale things, larger commercial systems, wind. There's a lot of stuff that they can kind of wind down, other generation sources, etc., before they go to the residential, or let's say smaller DR systems. Okay, that seemed to be the last question. Anyone else, any last comments there, I guess? Great webinar, thank you. As I said, we're going to run a second version, which a lot of these type of specific limits or specific things, when's coming generation, when's export limit, and the schedules. These are really important things to kind of know. These will be coming up in the second webinar, but also some of these things the DNSPs themselves may be able to also share with you. Will the end user be able to see how often they are affected? At the moment, they won't, but I think I've heard from if they do anything like South Australia, then like a bulletin will be kind of sent out that a shutdown's going to happen. However, I have no idea how that's going to work or what their plans are for doing it. So, but yeah, let's see. All right, so we've gone over time a fair bit. I hope that was useful information for you guys there. And as I said again, we will run a second session. So just look out for the posts and the ads for that. And we'll see you then. Thanks for joining.